You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This week's episode is about philosophy and parenting. So I've been doing a lot of reading about parenting because we have a young daughter now. And I did an episode recently called Why I Choose Peaceful Parenting. That was episode 272. And in that, I gave a brief introduction to this approach to peaceful parenting that we've adopted in our own parenting. And I've been looking around for resources on peaceful parenting and useful resources on parenting in general. And I've found some interesting stuff giving arguments to why you should adopt peaceful parenting to avoid some of the bad consequences that can come from practices like spanking. There's also empirical studies about the long-term damage that using violence and aggression on children can have. And that's all interesting stuff, but for myself, I'm really interested in principles. I like to try and get clear in my own mind what the principles are that I can use to understand how to approach a problem or a project or whatever else I'm tackling in life. And I think peaceful parenting is fundamentally rooted in some very important principles, but I haven't found a good resource that really explains that. So I've been thinking about this in my own mind, and I just wanted to explain it on this episode, and I'd love to hear your feedback as well and hear what you think. So I'm going to try and express the philosophical principles that underlie peaceful parenting, where they come from, how they apply to parenting, and what their implications are. And there are three really key philosophical principles that I'm going to go through. The three principles are, number one, children own themselves. Number two, parents have positive obligations towards children. And number three, it's wrong to initiate aggression on children. Those principles may sound very mundane and even kind of obvious, but their implications are far more far-reaching than you might first imagine. And they arise from really deep philosophical principles that are much broader than just relating to parenting. So I'm going to go through each one of the three principles in turn and explain where they come from, what they mean, and also then I'll end up by talking about some of the implications. The first principle that I mentioned is that children own themselves. This is simply part of a more general principle, which is that all people are self-owners. We are all morally equal as self-owners. And this is a principle that comes out of the Enlightenment as part of the growth of classical liberal values. And it's the idea that there's no justification for any particular group or class or caste or any other collective of people to have rights of ownership of other people. So every individual rightfully owns themselves. You own your own body, you own your own life. We all as individuals own ourselves. And it's this principle that gave rise to the abolitionist movement that abolished slavery all across the West and then all across the world for the first time in human history after the Enlightenment in the period of the Industrial Revolution. And it's also this principle that got rid of caste systems in feudal Europe and is slowly getting rid of remaining caste systems in some still developing parts of the world. So it's an incredibly powerful philosophical principle that humans are self-owners, that we own ourselves. And if you apply this to the family and to parenting, then what this principle really says is that children also own themselves. Children are not the property of their parents. They're not the slaves of their parents. They're not the pets of their parents. They're not owned by their parents. They are self-owners, just as every other person is a self-owner. And it's hard to see that with children because they are totally dependent on their parents. They're in a state of vulnerability. They won't survive without being cared for. And they're also incompetent. They're incapable of looking after themselves. They're incompetent to make a whole range of decisions about their own survival for the first period of their life. Because children are in this state of vulnerability, it's sometimes hard to understand that that doesn't prevent them from being self-owners. It doesn't make them the property of their parents just because they need looking after by their parents. And a way that I find helpful to clarify this is to think about an adult who is similarly dependent and in a state of needing care. As an analogy, let's imagine that you're a driver and you hit a pedestrian as a woman. You knock this woman over and she's now unconscious. Now, this woman is totally dependent now, and she may need all sorts of things in order to survive. She needs you to call an ambulance. She might need you to make sure her airway's not blocked. She might need CPR. She's going to have a whole range of needs to survive that she's not able to fulfill herself. Now, does that mean that this woman no longer owns herself? Not at all. We all understand it's still her life and it's still her body. And just because you now have to do some things to help her survive, it doesn't give you license to do anything you like to her. And in fact, if you do anything that is not strictly beneficial towards helping her recover, then you would actually be assaulting her. So this is a way of understanding that just because someone is in a state of dependency, it doesn't mean that they're not the rightful owner of their own body and their own life. If you knock down that pedestrian, she might need your help, and she might be in a state of dependency. She's going to need you to call the ambulance and all that kind of stuff. Doesn't mean that you can do anything you like, and it doesn't mean that she's not the rightful owner of her body and her life. If you have to make some decisions on her behalf, you have to do it very reasonably and only do things that are clearly in her self-interest. It's the same with children. Just because children are not capable of surviving without care and supervision from their parents and from adults, that doesn't mean that children are not self-owners. They are self-owners. They're morally equal as human beings. They own their own bodies and their own lives. And that's a really important principle with a lot of interesting implications. And we'll come on to those implications at the end. So that's the first principle. The second principle is that parents have positive obligations towards their children. Now, this comes from the general principle that we are responsible for our actions. We're all responsible for our actions. And when our actions have consequences, we can be held responsible for those consequences too, even if we haven't signed up to a contract. And that's how we get positive obligations. We get obligations as a consequence of the things that we agree to, or sometimes just the things that we do leading to consequences. To explain what I mean, I'll give you an example. If you are walking by a lake and someone falls in the lake, you are not obliged to jump in and try and save that person. You're not obliged to save any random stranger who falls in a lake. You can do so if you want. I mean, there's nothing stopping you doing so, but you're not morally obliged to risk your own safety if somebody else falls in a lake. But if you push that person into the lake, then it's an entirely different matter. Then you do have a moral obligation to save that person from the lake. And if you don't, and if they drown, then you're responsible for murder. So that's the difference between an unchosen positive obligation, which is, do you think you really have to jump into the lake to save any random stranger? And a chosen positive obligation, which is if you do something to put someone in danger, like push someone in a lake, you have to get them out. It's your responsibility. And if you don't, then you've committed an act of aggression, potentially a very serious one in this case. So that's the idea of people acquiring positive obligations through their actions. And it's the same with children. It's true that there's no contract between parents and children, and there can't be because children are incapable of writing a contract. But the point about parental obligations is that when you have a child, you have put that child in a position of danger. Just by making a baby, you've put another human being in a position of danger because that baby will not survive without help. So it's a bit like pushing someone into a lake. You've created a human life, and in that act of creating a human life, you've put that human life in danger. So it's your responsibility to get that person, that child, out of danger. And the way that you do that, if you push someone in a lake, is you get them out of the lake. The way that you do that, if you make a baby, is you have to nurture that child all the way until he is capable of surviving as an adult, all the way until he can make his own way in the world, he can look after himself, he can live independently, safely without you. Or you give the child to somebody who will responsibly adopt him and will do the nurturing instead of you. So that's a very important principle, that parents do have a positive obligation towards the well-being of their children, not because of any contract, but because they're responsible for their actions. And in this case, their action has been to create a human life. And in the act of creating a human life, you put that person in danger. It takes a bit of time to explain that principle, but it's really important because it's one of the things that underpins this whole philosophy behind peaceful parenting. And as I said, I'll explain the consequences in a minute. But first of all, let me tell you about the third principle of peaceful parenting, which is it's wrong to initiate aggression against children. And this is very clear. It just comes from the non-aggression principle itself. That's the principle that it's unjustifiable to initiate aggression, to attack someone, or to start physical coercion against someone. That's unjustifiable. Self-defense is okay, but initiating aggression is wrong. And of course, if that's a universal principle, then it does apply to parenting as well. And that just means that it's wrong to use aggression on children. So what do these principles really tell you about parenting? What are the implications of these philosophical principles? Well, like all philosophical principles, these are not going to give you specific prescriptions of what to do as a parent. You can't use philosophical principles like these to decide what the best way to teach a child to read is, or what you're going to do about bedtimes and meal times and these kinds of parenting questions. I think it informs all of those topics, but it doesn't mean that automatically from these principles you can get a single prescription for exactly what to say to your child, exactly how to parent, and what to do in specific circumstances. But what it does do is it gives you a framework to show what the boundaries of ethical parenting are and what the responsibilities of parents are, what is ethical and what's unethical. And the interesting thing for me is that thinking this through really carefully, I realized that there are a lot of very common parenting practices that totally violate these three principles. I mentioned a couple of these in the previous episode that I did on peaceful parenting. I'll just mention them briefly again. Spanking is a very common practice that directly violates the non-aggression principle. There's no way that spanking can be classed as self-defense, it's aggression. So if you accept the non-aggression principle, then you have to rule out spanking. Similarly, I think circumcision is a clear violation of the non-aggression principle. There's no medical need for it. The child's body belongs to the child. It's not yours to make that kind of decision about. So if you accept that children own themselves and that aggression is wrong and that parents have positive obligations towards their children, I don't think you can support circumcision either. And a really big one that I hadn't thought about a lot until now is abortion. I was raised very much in a pro-choice intellectual environment. I'm an atheist, so I don't have any religious issues with abortion, but I do want to make sure that those principles that I know are core values, I want to make sure I understand what their implications are. So a key question for me for any topic like abortion, if, for example, is, does this violate the non-aggression principle? And now that I've thought about it a lot, I think it blatantly does. I think it is a very clear violation of the non-aggression principle. In fact, abortion violates all three of these principles because children own themselves, it's their life and their body. Parents have positive obligations towards their children. We're responsible for our actions. So that means we have a responsibility as parents from the moment you get pregnant. And most importantly, it's wrong to initiate aggression. And abortion is simply not self-defense. There are some edge cases. There are very few examples where the health of the mother is involved. And I think at least it's possible to have a reasonable debate about things like abortion in cases of rape. But for the 95% of abortions that are the result of consensual sex, it's now absolutely clear to me that that violates the non-aggression principle. I know that libertarians who are very interested in the non-aggression principle generally tend to be pro-choice. So I know that I've come to a different conclusion than other people who value the non-aggression principle, but I just think that's a contradiction in the views of many libertarians. If you accept the non-aggression principle, I can't see how you can support abortion. There are many other parenting practices that I think these philosophical principles can give you real moral clarity on. For example, I think it's very wrong to threaten a child with the concept of hell. That is essentially a threat of violence, and it's totally unethical. I also think it's unethical to give children psychoactive drugs. like Ritalin and all of the other things that are given to so many children today. And there are other practices that I could go on and talk about, but the basic point I want to make is if you understand the principles involved, if you accept the principles, you can work out for yourself what you think is ethical in terms of parenting on the basis of these enlightenment principles that I think most of us agree with. Most of us agree that we all own ourselves. Every individual's life is their own, and every individual's body is their own. Most of us agree that you're responsible for your actions. You have to take responsibility. If you put someone in danger, then you have to get them out of danger. And most of us would agree that it's wrong to initiate aggression. But the key thing is if you want to live with integrity, then you have to think through what the implications of accepting these basic philosophical principles are, even if that means that you end up realizing that some things that you thought were ethical are just not ethical. And I mean, that's the case for me, for example, when it comes to abortion. I never thought about it that much in the past, and now that I have, I think it's very clearly a violation of the non-aggression principle. And if you want to be a peaceful parent, I don't think you can support that. So those are some of the thoughts that I've had in thinking through what my philosophical principles are that I hold as core values and what the implications of those principles are for this particular area of life, of parenting. I realize I've said a lot of things that a lot of people will disagree with. I'm very interested to hear your comments. If you think I've missed something or misunderstood how to apply these principles, or if you think that there's an issue with any of the principles that I've raised, I'd love to hear your constructive criticism and suggestions as to how I can think more clearly and consistently about these topics, because I really do value trying to live with integrity to core principles, even if it means ending up with conclusions that I didn't expect in the beginning to come to, and that can sometimes be a bit shocking. But we do have to follow logic and rational argument to whatever implications it leads us to, and if we're uncomfortable with the implications, then we've either got to find a flaw in the logic, or we just have to accept that sometimes the truth is uncomfortable. I hope you find that interesting. Let me know what you think.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you have feedback about the show, please email jake@thevoluntarylife.com. If you enjoyed this program, please share the podcast with your friends or click the donate button on thevoluntarylife.com.